Hello and welcome back to MCU and Comics. My name is Peter Levi, and today we are going to do the vlog associated with the article I put out about Wolverine in the MCU. And specifically, I'm interested in his origin story, and what I think Marvel might do with it, and certainly what I would like them to do with it. So a little context before we get rolling on that. For me personally, when I was collecting comics, reading comics on a regular basis, I started with the X-Men. This would be in the late 80s. And Wolverine certainly was, pretty much immediately, one of my favorite characters. At the time, there were very few characters like him, which is probably why he became as successful as he did. When I stopped reading regularly, which was in the 90s, there was a proliferation of Wolverine and Punisher clones, which diminished everyone, really. That's one of the many problems, I would say, of comics in the 90s at Marvel. But Wolverine was created in 1974, became an X-Men in 1975 when the team was rebooted into the iteration that people know best. And his origin was fairly cohesive and coherent from its beginning for about the first 10 to 12 years. And then beginning in 1986 with Bill Mantlo in Alpha Flight, and subsequently on and on and on and on through a whole bunch of other different creators, it has become a giant, incoherent, ridiculous mess. And the Fox films took an interesting approach to it. Wolverine is presented in the very first X-Men film, the Bryan Singer film. His origin is pretty simple. While it does borrow elements from the comics, it's largely sort of its own thing. And then you had the 3 solo films for Wolverine. Logan doesn't really count, as that's the end story, so it doesn't really touch on his origin. It's just wrapping up his story. But the first 2 films are very much in touch with Wolverine's origin, and they owe a lot to this later revised material. And it's my hope that means we can jettison all that crap and get back to the original iteration or something pretty close to it. And I'll go into why I don't like the changes, and why I like the original, and what I could put up with if I don't get that original either. But we do keep in mind, one of the things that Kevin Feige said when the X-Men were reacquired was that he wanted to do something different. That doesn't necessarily mean we won't get anything that Fox did, but it's highly suggestive that if we do, it'll be quite different. And so that at least is an arrow in my quiver for hoping that this might be the case. Now, I'm sort of assuming that if you're reading this blog and watching these videos, you know who Wolverine is, so we're going to skip over that. I'm going to very briefly, well, I'll try to be very briefly, go through his original origin, what its sort of shape was, and briefly go through how it's changed, and then talk about what I think the MCU might do. So he appeared in 1974, as I said. He was invented by Len Wein, and he appeared in The Incredible Hulk. At the time, Hulk was fighting a villain called the Wendigo in Canada, and Wolverine is sent by the Canadian government to see what's going on and stop it. He's a Canadian government agent. A year later, in 1975, Len Wein again writes Giant-Sized X-Men #1. This is the starting off point of the rebooted, revised X-Men. The original X-Men are from the 60s. That's Iceman, Beast, Angel, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Charles Xavier. Was never hugely popular. But Wein, but specifically Chris Claremont, who takes over right after the Giant-Sized X-Men, is the one who made them into the gigantic, successful IP that they've been since the 70s. So in Giant-Sized X-Men, Wolverine is again reintroduced. And here, Charles Xavier recruits him. He's known as Weapon X. And essentially, what he offers him is freedom from government service if he comes with him to join the X-Men. And Wolverine does want that. And his government superiors don't like that he's leaving. Now, this gets paid off 3 years later with Chris Claremont when another Canadian government agent, James Hudson, then known as Weapon Alpha, but also called Vindicator and then Guardian, is sent to go retrieve Wolverine. He's considered government property, so he's AWOL. So James Hudson goes to get him. He obviously fails, but we learn that the two were virtually brothers in the past. That's one of Wolverine's. Can't remember if it's a comment or a thought bubble. Then a year later, Claremont and John Byrne, who would have a lot more to do with his origin subsequently, though I imagine in concert with Claremont, we get Alpha Flight showing up, trying to accomplish the same thing, trying to bring Wolverine back. So Alpha Flight is a Canadian superhero team. They might be the only one in Marvel. I could be wrong about that. Certainly the only one to have their own comic, I believe. And they are designed kind of like the Avengers, kind of like the X-Men. They're not like the X-Men exactly because they're not all mutants. So I guess a bit more like the Avengers. But here we're told Alpha Flight's headquarters are in Ottawa. And we get a bit more about Wolverine's origin. So we learn that Wolverine was believed to be an uncontrollable psycho, according to government psychologists. But James Hudson didn't go along with that. He thought something could be done to help him. And we learn in Hudson's internal monologue that he actually originally wanted Wolverine to lead Alpha Flight. And the other members of Alpha Flight all respect him. Sasquatch, one of the members, refers to him as Captain, which actually doesn't make any sense the way the Canadian military works, but I don't think we have to worry about nuance like that. And Hudson also thinks to himself that when he found Wolverine, he was like a feral wild child that he and his wife, Heather, gave a home to. A year later, Tom DeFalco in Machine Man, where some members of Alpha Flight appeared, tells us that the government agency in charge of Alpha Flight is called Department H. And this would remain the case until either the end of the 80s or I think it's the early 90s. Rob Liefeld changed it to Department K. I have no idea why. Maybe he likes Special K. Bob's your uncle. Who knows why? So now it's not just sort of the Canadian government blankly. There's a specific agency that's in charge. And also in that year, Alpha Flight again appears in X-Men. This time, Wolverine's visiting them to make peace. So he goes to see Heather McNeil, that's James Hudson's wife, reveals his name is Logan. That would remain his name until it was changed over 20 years later for no reason at all. This is something that Heather and James have known, but it's not something that's widely known. We get, just looking for things that are different here, Wolverine mentions that he was Canada's James Bond when he was a government agent. And that Hudson's special suit, because like Iron Man, he wears a suit, was designed to protect him from Wolverine's claws. Snowbird, one of the Alpha Flight members, calls him a good leader. Wolverine recalls being nursed back to health by James and Heather, and that he had been frozen, starved, and near death when they got hold of him. He hates the adamantine treatment that occurred afterward. This is pretty important, by the way. Later changes have this treatment occur much earlier. And he believes the treatment helped turn him into a killer. He hates that the government had him perform dirty tasks, a bit like Winter Soldier, but also hates the fact that he did it. Again, a bit like the Winter Soldier. So after Wolverine helps Alpha Flight out again with the Wendigo, oddly enough, he's told he's a free man. The Canadian government won't come after him again. And we're told that Alpha Flight and Department H are disbanded for budgetary reasons. And this will lead into the Alpha Flight comic almost 4 years later. The following year, so we're 1981 in real time, we have Heather and James appear again in the X-Men, and it's reasserted that Wolverine was thought to be some sort of berserker, but that they believed he was not. And then finally we get to John Byrne all by himself, and this is in Alpha Flight. This is towards the end of his run. And we get a flashback to when Wolverine leaves for the X-Men. Here we learn that Hudson didn't changed his mind about Wolverine leading Alpha Flight because he was simply too aggressive. He talks about years of therapy being required for him just to be functional. Pardon me, Wolverine refers to Hudson as his closest friend. That he was older than both. And that's trivial stuff. But yeah, and we it's also just contextually, Wolverine does the secret agent stuff after he's met the pair. So this is all very, very coherent. At some point in the past, Wolverine was something of a wild thing. He was found, saved by James and Heather. The government thought he was too crazy to be of any use to anybody. The two disagreed, helped him recover. He was given the treatment, became he became Weapon X and became sort of the leading Canadian agent, doing a lot of secret missions. He was part of Alpha Flight, but ultimately resented what he'd been turned into, thus joined the X-Men, and none of that impacted his relationship either with his former teammates or with Hudson or with Heather McNeil. He still remained close to them or felt close to them. So that carries us from 1974 all the way to 1986. And this is where Bill Mantlo in Alpha Flight starts to tinker with things. So here, instead of Wolverine being starved and cold and desperate, instead he savagely attacks the pair. Heather shoots him point blank with a shotgun, which knocks him out. Then we go through the recuperation process. We learn that Wolverine served in World War II. There's more confirmation, and this isn't new from Mantlo, but more confirmation that Wolverine had a crush on Heather. We get a different origin for the adamantium process. Originally, it's just the Canadian government doing it. Mantlo instead says it's Lord Darkwind who came up with the process, and that James Hudson was willingly and actively a participant in having the procedure done to Wolverine. Now, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense for someone you see as a brother and your best friend. The only way you could ever make that work is that it's a secret. But that part of Mantlo's origin actually winds up being abandoned because no other writer could figure out how the hell you were going to make that work. So thankfully that at least got jettisoned. And he also included the fact that Hudson conspired to have Wolverine attack he and his wife. It's really bizarre. But Mantlo generally wanted Hudson portrayed darkly and Heather to be portrayed ineffectual, because he was more interested in his own characters. But that's by the by in Alpha Flight. You can read more about that in my Alpha Flight article if it interests you. Then a little while after that, Larry Hama, in Wolverine's second solo run, says that Wolverine and Sabretooth were around for JFK's assassination. So that's a pretty big change. Wolverine is an active agent of some sort long before he meets James and Heather, which doesn't make any sense for the history that's established with he and Alpha Flight. There'd be no need really for government assessment. Government would have already known who he was. The years of being helped by the pair, not necessary really, not in the same context anyway. It's quite dumb. Then in 97, Roger Stern in Untold Tales of Spider-Man had him working with Peter Parker's parents at the CIA. Now, what's a Canadian agent doing working at the CIA? Who knows? But this is part of a broad trend to push the character away from Canada and into American history. A year after that, Steve Siegel in the second volume of Alpha Flight actually built on Mantlow's revised origin. But because that's been moved away from, we won't go through with what he did because it's not canon anymore. A little while after that, we have the big one, Wolverine: The Origin from 2001. That's Paul Jenkins, Joe Quesada, and Bill Yamos. I don't know how to say his last name. Sorry. And this has all sorts of garbage in it, some of which we saw in the Fox films. Suddenly, he's James Hallett for some reason. He was born in the 19th century for some reason. He's been very active in a lot of things for some reason. None of this helps inform anything, but this has become canon. A few years later, Daniel Way in the third Wolverine iteration solo comic. Now he's having interactions with Winter Soldiers. That'd be after World War II. He gets another Japanese love interest. For some reason, writers have had a fascination with Chris Claremont's basically one-off of Wolverine falling in love with Mariko, which is I think a 1981 or 82 story. And even though Claremont was very good at understanding if you tell a story, what's important is moving on from it while reflecting on it. People just keep repeating that story because that's not the only new Japanese lover he gets. Then Jeff Loeb, the guy who used to be in charge of Marvel Entertainment, was also writing on the third volume of Wolverine, and he had him involved in the Hand. We get more Sabretooth. He gets another love interest, Silver Fox. A few years later, Jason Aaron, who's famous for Thor comics, was writing the fourth volume of Wolverine, and now Wolverine's fathered a whole bunch of children who are after him. This is all just ridiculous. It's a ton of stuff happening decades before his original emergence. And it doesn't add anything interesting to who he is. And all it does is denude the character evolution you had in the earlier comics. And the reason you're getting this is not because it's necessary, but because it allows writers to put their own stamp on the character. And this isn't just a Wolverine thing. This happens in comics a lot, but typically you'll get someone who comes in who just sweeps it away because it's silly. It was just like, okay, this is just too much stuff. But Wolverine's so tremendously popular that you can give him all sorts of silly origin stories and people will eat him up because it's Wolverine, even if if you put it all together, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So let's go back to this simpler, nice, coherent origin story, just boiled down to its essence. So here seems to be what was generally agreed on between Claremont and Byrne, building off whatever Len Wein gave them. So his real name is Logan. Last name unknown, and that's a beautiful thing. An air of mystery on a character like that is perfect. His nickname is Wolverine. The comics have probably come up with an answer for this, but I don't remember ever hearing one when I was reading comics, so it must have come later if there is one. Very few people know him as Logan, so he generally goes by Wolverine as his name. His initial designation as a Canadian agent and hero is Weapon X, which I think most people know, even casual people probably know that. The background. So he was kind of a feral creature. Older than James and Heather, although it's not established that he's this ancient thing, which is what happens later on. It's in fact far more likely that he was probably born maybe in the 30s, something like that. But the intention is not to make him this ancient being. Instead, he's a little older than James Hudson. We'll get into his age in a second. And he was kind of feral. He was a berserker, kind of crazy. And when he's found in a very rough state and saved by James and Heather, he's taken to psychologists to say, no, he's a psycho. It's never going to get any better. He's a lost cause. He should be institutionalized. The two disagree, help him recoup through years of therapy. And then, so after that, he becomes important to the government, and he's put through the adamantine procedure. Byrne seems to have changed his mind about the involvement of Hudson there, but what he landed on is what makes sense, which is James was not involved, and he can't be if he's a best friend and a brother-like figure. He can't be unless you want him to be a villain, and Byrne didn't want him to be that. James Hudson is meant to be a fundamental founding figure for Alpha Flight. He's meant to be a touchstone for their evolution. So he can't be a secret bad guy. It doesn't work. So the adamantium process happens. Then he starts training with Alpha Flight. He starts going out on missions. And during this time, initially, James Hudson wants him to lead Alpha Flight as Weapon X, but eventually decides he's simply too aggressive to be able to do it. So we don't know exactly how long he serves with Alpha Flight. Pardon me, long enough for the core members to know him and think of him well. But this unhappiness is the angle that Charles Xavier exploits to bring him into the X-Men, and there he stays. But he doesn't leave his former teammates with acrimony. He just wants that independence. The sort of sundry detail is he has a crush on Heather, which is a thematic echo of his crush on Jean Grey. They're both younger, red-headed women who are already in relationships. That's the kind of thing that, you could easily drop. You don't need him to have that, but you can understand sort of them wanting to have that thematic echo for him. So if you're looking for sort of a timeline, keeping in mind Marvel time and real time are different, but just for bare numbers. So if we're taking the Wolverine appearance in The Incredible Hulk as a date, he's going to fight him in 1974. And I don't mean the MCU is going to have a flashback movie where he's in the 70s. That's not what I mean, just for context. So if 74 is your sort of marker year, then I would say he would have met Heather and James no more than 10 years earlier. Probably not quite that far back. We know that Heather McNeil met James when she was 17. She became his secretary. So James would have been in his late 20s probably. The two very quickly become a couple and get married. And then James leaves Amcam Petroleum, where he works, after he's built the suit because he doesn't trust them with it. So what seems like just a couple years after that, because Heather is still quite young, they rescue Wolverine. And then we have the years of therapy, possibly 2 or 3. So I would say it's about 3-ish years. I mean, you can make it whatever you want, but say 3-ish years before he goes into Department H and goes through the adamantium process and becomes a member of Alpha Flight. So he has this fight with the Hulk. So you could say that Wolverine's years as an agent and a Canadian hero are somewhere between 4 and 5 years, somewhere in there. And then he accepts the offer to leave. And all that, it makes sense, it follows, it leaves some mystery for you to explore with Wolverine if you want to, but it's not overly convoluted. He's not involved in every serious incident in the world from the 19th century onward. He hasn't interacted with everybody. Like, it's all the silly, goofy things that come later are just dispatched with. It's clean, it's simple. You can take that origin and you can do an origin movie and it's going to make sense. What you could change if you wanted to, if you're the MCU and you're like, this Alpha Flight stuff's too complicated, let's get rid of it. You could get rid of it. You could get rid of his romantic feelings towards Heather McNeil as well. I don't think that's necessary. You could even get rid of James and Heather altogether. You could have Wolverine discovered by the Canadian government, experimented on, and then leaves. That would work. It's more interesting, I think, for him to have had a friend, an ally, a confidant, especially 2 very different ones. James is an active, he's Weapon Alpha. He's part of the team that Wolverine is in, while his wife is more of an emotional support, a confidant, someone he can go to in a different way. So I think there's value there. But if you don't want the film cluttered up with Alpha Flight characters, that's one way to do it, and it would still function. So what you have is Wolverine is still damaged by his past, which is what you want. The X-Men offer him a way out, which is what you want. He still has that air of mystery, again, what you want. And he has things from his past that can come back to haunt him if you want to deal with that, as well as characters of his own who aren't attached to the X-Men, who you can tap into if you want to have lots of Wolverine solo films. And why wouldn't you? Of course you want Wolverine solo films. And you don't want those films to be dependent on the X-Men. You don't want to over pollute the two IPs with one another. It's more interesting to have Wolverine appear with the X-Men and then do his own things than to have Wolverine appear with the X-Men and then a bunch of X-Men appear with Wolverine when he's doing his stuff. Exceptions to be made, of course. You can have a person there. You know, he's a very iconic adventure with Kitty Pryde, for example. But it's a good place to build, and you can very easily do a film that way. And certainly the Russos have intimated, a little indirectly maybe, but intimated they want to do that kind of film because they've talked about doing his first appearance with the Incredible Hulk. If you read that issue, it's very boring. It's just a fight between the Hulk and Wendigo. Wolverine shows up, he fights the Hulk. They realize they're on the same side. They beat the Wendigo. It's not very interesting. But if you added in that depth, what's going on with the Canadian government, with James and Heather, you get a much more interesting dynamic that can lead you into him joining the X-Men. It gives them a place to go. Now, I don't know that that will be the case. I don't know if Marvel will go that way. Canada is a inconsequential market, both for theater release, for streaming, for merch. It doesn't really matter. And, you know, you'd be far better off tapping into other things. But it's distinctive. No one else is going to do a story like that. Fox ran away from it. Never really touched it. Like James Hudson appears in, I can't remember if it's the first or the second Wolverine movie. I think it's the first one, but it's not done the same way at all. So I think that gives you some room to do some really unique, interesting things. And if you think that an Alpha Flight show could work, which I think it could, Alpha Flight's weird in a great way. Why not? And if we're gonna get an Echo show, which is the current buzz, and no one knows who the hell Echo is, you know, why wouldn't you think about something weird and wacky like Alpha Flight? But I guess I'm probably rambling on a little too much. But yeah, I'd really like to see this. I don't like all the additional stuff that was added. It's not because it was added. It's because what was added is not interesting. And when I say not interesting, I don't mean you can't read those comics and go, oh, okay, here's him having an adventure with Sabretooth in the 60s. That can be entertainingly written, but it doesn't serve the character later on because none of his development reflects that past until 30, 40 years into the writing of that character. So, you know, Adventures with Sabretooth, it's like, well, how come that meant nothing to him for 30 years and now it does? You know what I mean? It's kind of silly. And Marvel doesn't have the time for that sort of thing. Not really. You can't sit there and dwell on things like that. I also think prequel films, by the way, are almost always terrible. You know, what are your stakes? The character's going to be fine. You've already seen them fine afterwards, sometimes in multiple films, so it's not that interesting. But yeah, so I hope we get this simpler iteration. We get his Canadian origin. We get those complications. It's good for his character. It provides the proper motivation for him to move over to the X-Men. Also gives him something to deal with afterwards. So, at least for me, I'm crossing my fingers for something like that. I think this is quite a ways away. Probably 2024 to 25. More likely 25, unfortunately. But yeah, that would be fantastic. And yeah, that's about all I want to say about that. So next up for me, I have to record a video for the News Digest I dropped today and go through that. And we'll try to get that done before the next episode of Falcon and Winter Soldier. So thanks for watching, and we will see you all next time. If I can find my mouse. There it is.